Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wehner. Today we've got a hand where we face some nasty aggression on the turn after turning the second nuts. If you ever find yourself struggling to know how to navigate some of these spots in PLO where you've got a very strong hand but your opponent might have the nuts and he's representing the nuts, make sure to stick around for the analysis. This is part 2 of 4 in a PLO series Dylan Weissman and I are uploading in the lead up to our launch of Upswing Poker's Advanced PLO Mastery course, so stay on the lookout for that coming up. Now let's get on to the hand. So here's the spot that we encounter. We're playing four-handed 10-20 PLO here. We're in the big blind with 7-7-6-5 single suited. The action starts off with the cutoff folding and the button opening to $70. Small blind folds, and we have a very easy defend here. This hand is way too strong to fold and also way too weak to be 3-betting. We flop pretty poorly on the Jack-5 deuce two-tone with just middle pair, a pocket pair, and a backdoor flush draw, and at this point in the hand we have a very easy check fold. So we do check to our opponent, who also checks back. We turn Gen with the beautiful 7 of diamonds on the turn, giving us a naked set, and in this position, when our opponent has a capped range, we want to make sure that we have plenty of strong hands in our turn checking range, because since our opponent has a capped range, we're going to want to apply a lot of pressure to that range when he does bet. So we want to make sure that that pressure that we're applying comes from both made hands such as this, as well as weaker hands that generate a lot of EV whenever they accrue folds from our opponent. So we need some strong hands in our turn checking range here. This type of combination can mix between betting and checking on the turn. In this particular instance, I choose to check. Our opponent goes ahead and delayed c-bets, and we have set ourselves up in a nice position here, making sure that our range has some strong hands in this position, and we have a very easy check raise here. All of our hands here that arrive to this point that are Jack-7 or better are going to be pure check raising, and our size is going to be raising to full pot because we want to apply as much pressure as possible to our opponent's range when his range is capped in a position like this. So we do go ahead and check raise to full pot. And then to our surprise and potential dismay, the opponent goes ahead and effectively shoves all in on us. And this is a position that is really hard to think about how to analyze. I think when people get into this spot, sometimes we think, does he have it? Does he not? Is he bluffing? Would he bluff this spot? And you don't have to approach it like that. You can actually use modern tools and modern software to analyze this spot and come to a much more informed decision about what to do next. So using Munker Solver, there's a very powerful tool called the equity graph that I use throughout my upcoming PLO Mastery course, which I want to show you an example of how it can be used in this position to better analyze this spot. So a good place to start our analysis of this spot is by running this hand through Munker Solver, and instead of looking at our exact hand, zooming out a little bit and looking at broader hand classes in the area of the hand that we have. So looking at these two equity graphs, I'm looking at two different hand classes. First of all being middle set here, pocket sevens, which we have, naked indicating there's no backup, and also naked top two pair here, because these are the two hand classes that are the closest decisions in this spot and that are the hardest to play. So what these two equity graphs show is how ranges are faring here, one player versus the other player. So on the vertical axis here, we see how much equity each player has, and on the horizontal axis here, we see with which hands they have that much equity. So in these two positions, our opponent is the red line in both of these equity graphs. Our hero is the blue line. So we see here that when we have pocket sevens, our pocket sevens are going to have some amount of equity. This means 0 and this means 100. So we see here that it's around 40% equity, and it's confirmed here that it's 39% equity. Our opponent, on the other hand, can have a variety of different equity, because remember, we're looking at pocket sevens for our hero, but we're looking at our opponent's entire range. So you'll notice that a huge portion of our opponent's range here has almost 100% equity. This is about 98% equity with this 10, 20, 30, 40, 43 or so percent of his range. And that's when he has pocket jacks, because we're basically dead and we'll be torching if we pile it in versus pocket jacks. And then you'll see this huge drop off in equity, and then kind of this more gradual tiered system of equity that the rest of our opponents have, that the rest of our opponents' hands have. And this portion of our opponent's range represents all of his semi-bluffs. So he should be shoving a lot of hands here that are like combo draws, combinations like a wrap with the flush draw, maybe the nut flush draw with an open-ender, maybe a pair with an open-ender with a flush draw. And these hand classes are going to have various amounts of equity against us. And you can see that some of them are going to have around 50% equity, and then the weaker ones are going to taper off to kind of 20 or 30% equity. So this is what we're facing here when we have pocket sevens and we get shoved on. We're facing pocket jacks close to half the time and a variety of semi-bluffs that we're doing anywhere from okay against to quite well against. So that puts us in a really tough spot here, because with the offered pot odds, Munker Solver is actually both calling and folding some of these naked pocket seven combos. This is really the hand class that it's exactly indifferent between continuing and folding with. When we compare that analysis to another similar hand class, looking here at naked jack seven, this hand class is an interesting comparison, because even though it is of lower absolute hand strength, it has a very favorable blocker being the jack, because it reduces the likelihood that our opponent will have top set. And that's reflected here in the equity graph. We see that now this portion of our opponent's range that has almost all the equity has been reduced from between 40 and 50% of his range here to only 10, 20, 30, just a hair over 30% of his range here. And that's because he'll have less combinations of top set that could have potentially slow played the flop, because we have a jack blocker with this hand class. So from that sense, it looks like we'd rather continue here with jack seven it looks like we would rather continue here with jack seven compared to continuing with pocket sevens, even though it's a weaker overall absolute hand strength. But when we continue our analysis, we see that after our opponent's equity drops off here, this is the same range of semi-bluffs that he's shoving here that we looked at here. And now we notice that these semi-bluffs have a lot more equity against jack seven compared to pocket sevens, because pocket sevens will have a lot of board pairing rivers that can lock it up for us when our opponent quote unquote gets there with a flush draw, whereas jack seven won't have those same benefits. So we see that there's both an advantage to having jack seven, being that we block the top set with the jacks, but there's also a disadvantage in that we have less equity versus our opponent's semi-bluffs. You see here that all of our opponent's semi-bluffs have much more equity versus this hand class than they do versus this hand class. So these are the two closest hand classes whenever we're making a turn decision here. Munker Solver is leaning towards slightly continuing with the naked 7-7 and slightly folding with the naked jack 7, but it's mixing both of these hand classes. So we can conclude from there that weaker value check raises on the turn, hands like pocket fives or pocket deuces, lower sets, are going to be really easy check raise folds when we get piled on here, because they're going to have less equity and everything is going to be less favorable in those hand classes compared to the two hand classes we looked at here. And that leads me to a concept that I want to zoom out from this specific hand to cover more broadly. And that's that whenever we check raise on the turn in this instance, we have both check raises for value and check raises for bluffs. Our value combinations are hands like jack 7 or better. We have some very strong semi-bluffs, and then we also have some bluff hands. And I think people are making the mistake of thinking that every time that they check raise for value, they need to play for stacks. That's not true at all. There are plenty of hands that generate way more value in a check raise line in a spot like this, such as pocket fives or pocket deuces, or even some of these jack 7 combinations, that are not strong enough to play for stacks whenever you surprisingly get 3-bet on the turn here. So don't make the mistake of thinking that just because a hand is strong enough to check raise for value, it's also strong enough to play for stacks with. Those hands should still be check raised for value, even if they have to fold to turn 3-bets, because they'll be generating so much value whenever they generate a fold on the turn, or whenever our opponent bluff catches us on the turn and river with a weaker combination, and all those other lines occur. So now after analyzing those equity graphs, we know that if we have a hand like naked pocket sevens or naked jack seven here, we're basically indifferent between continuing and folding. These are the type of hands that could go either way in this situation. We've also learned that some of our other value check raises, hands like pocket fives or pocket deuces, are preferring to fold here exclusively. Now that we know these baselines, now that we understand the theory, we know that we're in the part of our range in this specific spot where we could go either way, so this is a good place to employ some reads. If you think it's likely that your opponent may be bluffing a little too often here, it's fine to continue. If you think your opponent's a little too snug here, it's fine to fold. If you have no reads on your opponent, it's fine to mix it up with this combination. Whereas if you had a combination like pocket fives or pocket deuces, you would need a much stronger read to continue with those. And if your read didn't feel too strong and you weren't very confident in it, it'd be much better to go with the baseline play of folding those combinations. So in real time, I decided to shove this combination readless versus my opponent. He, of course, calls, and we run into the 10-9-8-7 double suited. He played his hand really well. Whenever we look back at those equity graphs, we know that whenever we're shoving the turn here with naked sevens, we're going to run into top set a little shy of half the time, and then the remaining combinations we'll run into are going to be largely dominated by semi-bluffs like this. So a combination like a wrap and a flush draw is totally fine to bet 3-bet the turn with here, and our opponent chooses a semi-bluff to balance out some of those top sets that he slow played from the flop, so I think he played his hand really well. This has been one short example of how we can all use solvers to better understand tough spots that we run into in PLO. Every spot in this hand, along with dozens more, are covered in the course. Topics covered include opening ranges, pre-flop defense ranges and 3-betting ranges, flop leading ranges, flop c-betting ranges, responses versus flop c-betting ranges, turn probing ranges, a probe being betting the turn out of position after the flop has checked through, delayed c-betting ranges, responses to delayed c-betting ranges, and on and on. Each of these topics has at least a dedicated video to it, if not a dedicated video series to it. Dylan and I have essentially created a library of content for you to reference so that anytime you run into a gross spot in your own games, you'll have reference material to better help you solve that spot. If you like this analysis, make sure that you stay tuned for part 3, which will be released next week, in which we'll look at a spot that comes up all the time where many of our opponents are not balanced, and we can find some additional aggression that might not be intuitive that can really crush them. This has been Chris Wehner. Have a great day.